Assalamualaikum. We are from BA2494B. We'll be presenting about Hiwala, which is transfer of debt.
In literal terms, Hiwala means to move, shifting from one place to another that is derived from the word tahwil. Meanwhile, in technical terms, it is to make a transfer of a debt from one person to another person with the same price. However, it comes to the consequences that the liability of the debtor is abolished. It means that the first obligator is free from any financial obligations. There are two kinds of hiwala, which are hiwala al-haq, transfer of right, and hiwala al-dain, transfer of debt from the transferor to the payer. The responsibility is shifted from one person to another once the settlement happens through the transfer of a claim of a debt. Al-hiwala is similar to the sale of debt. However, it is not a sale. Therefore, it is a unique contract which has its own distinct features and conditions. There are three important participants in the hiwala contract. It is the principal debtor, the creditor, and the transferee. Furthermore, the debt is no longer demanded by the principal debtor as a valid hiwala is concluded. Besides that, hiwala established a right for the creditor to demand the settlement of the debt from the transferee.
Next is types of hiwala.
There are two types of hiwala, which are hiwala muqayyadah and hiwala mutlaqah. Hiwala muqayyadah is restricted hiwala, which means it is restricted by a stipulation. It is transaction where the payer is restricted to settling the amount of the transfer debt from the amount of financial or tangible asset that belongs to the transferor and is in the possession of the payer. The transferee to pay from property of the transferor owned to him by the transferee or in the hand of the transferee. This type of hiwala normally happens when a transfer is made with reference to the debt on the transferee. Furthermore, this type of transfer of debt is common to society. For example, A is in debt to B and C is in debt to A. Instead of paying to A, C pays to B, which will settle the obligation for both A and C. Next is hiwala mutlaqah, which is absolute hiwala. It is not restricted for payment to be made from property of the transferor in the hands of the transferee. It is kind of transfer of debt in which the transferor is not the creditor to the payer. The payer undertakes to pay the amount of the debt owned by the transferor from his own funds and to have recourse afterward to the transferor for settlement, provided that the transfer for payment was made on the order of the transferor. As for example, A owns 100,000 to B and he then transferred the obligation to C, which then C settles the debt by paying 100,000 to B. Furthermore, it usually happens when the contract is concluded without reference to the debt on the transferee and he accepts the transfer.
Let's move to the evidence of hiwala.
Next is evidence of hiwala. This unique contract has been applied since a long time ago. Hadith narrated by Hurairah, the Prophet Muhammad SAW said, "Who of you the debt is transferred to a rich person to settle the debt, please just accept the offer." Narrated by Salama bin al-Aqwa, once while we were sitting in the company of the Prophet, a dead man was brought. The Prophet Muhammad was requested to lead the funeral prayer for the deceased. He said, "Is he in debt?" The people replied in the negative. He said, "Has he left any wealth?" They said, "No." So he led his funeral prayer. Another dead man was brought, and the people said, "O Allah's portal, lead his funeral prayer." The Prophet said, "Is he in debt?" They replied, "Yes." He said, "Has he left any wealth?" They replied, 3 dinars. So he led the prayers. Then a third dead man was brought, and the people said to the Prophet, "Please lead his funeral prayer." He then asked, "Has he left any wealth?" They said, "No." He asked, "Is he in debt?" They said, "Yes, he has to pay 3 dinars." He then refused to pray and said, "Then pray for your dead companion." Abu Qatadah said, "O Allah's portal, lead his funeral prayer and I will pay his debt." So he led the prayer, which means the transfers of a debt from one person to another. Narrated by Jubair bin Abdullah, once the Prophet said to me, "If the money of Bahrain come, I will give you a certain amount of it." The Prophet had breathed his last before the money of Bahrain arrived. When the money of Bahrain reached, Abu Bakr announced, "Whoever was promised by the Prophet should come to us." And then I went to Abu Bakr and said, "The Prophet promised me so." Abu Bakr gave me a handful of coins, and when I count them, there were 500 in numbers. Abu Bakr then said, "Take twice the amount you have taken." Next is Ijma. There is a disagreement between scholars on the acceptability of Al-Hiwala. Scholars from the Maliki, Shafi'i, Zahiri, and some of the Hanafi schools are of the opinion that Al-Hiwala is a sale of debt for debt. However, it is permissible and it is an exception from the general rule. The legality comes because it is based on the needs of people and it is regarded as a special sympathy of the lawgiver which facilitates its acceptance. The Shafi'i and Maliki and most scholars regarded Al-Hiwala acceptance as recommended. Next is the Hanbali and their counterparts from Hanafi Mazhab have a different opinion which indicates that Al-Hiwala is a dependent contract and permissible as Al-Hiwala can be applied for special needs. The Hanbali school of jurisprudence made it compulsory for the debt owner to accept and comply with the transfer. Their opinion is based on the hadith. If your debt is transferred from your debtor to a rich debtor, you should agree. However, the Hanafi school regarded it as a permissible act, arguing that they are among the wealthy people who are defaulting for no reason and manipulating people's right and debt repayment. Next is pillars of Al-Hiwala. First of all, Al-Muhil, which is a person who is transfer his debt to another person. Next is Al-Muhal, a creditor whom his property or debt is transferred to be paid by another person instead of his debtor or the transferee. The third is Muhal Alai. Muhal Alai is a person who is in debt to someone. Next is Al-Muhal Bih, the things which are transferred by the debt. Last but not least is Sigoh, which is offered and accepted, or in Arab is Ijab and Kabul. Next is condition of the contract. Both the transferor and the transferee must be legally competent to act independently and shall give their consent on the Hiwala agreement. The acceptance of the creditor and the transferee should be given during the session of the contract. Furthermore, the transferor must be a debtor to the transferee. In a restricted Hiwala, the payer must be the debtor to the transferor. Both the transferee and the debt to be used for settlement must be known and transferable. Apart from that, in restricted Hiwala, the transfer debt or transfer portion of the debt must be equal to the debt owed to the transferee in terms of kind, type, quality, and amount. However, the transferor may transfer a lesser amount of debt owed to the transferee to be settled from a larger amount owed by the transferor on condition that the transferee be entitled to the equivalent amount of his debt.
So, I will explain about the flows of Hiwala. If we look at the figure, first, the muhil, which is the transferor or the debtor, will make an offer, which is ijab, to transfer his muhalbi. Muhalbi is the debt or things which is transferred to the muhal alaihi, which is the transferee, and the transferee will accept kabul, the Hiwala process. Then the transferee will have to pay the debt to the muhallah, which is the creditor. The Sharia issue that may be recognized is that the threat of non-compliance arises as there may be loss of charity in defining and putting percent of price proposed within the transaction. While it is allowed to take a few price, strict Sharia position calls for this price to be justified with the actual price to supply the service. It is possible that the purchaser may also take benefit of this situation and delaying charge to the banks. There are some of major legal consequences of Hiwala. First, a valid Hiwala discharge from the transferor from any debt liabilities and any claims in respect of it. In other words, there are no right of recourse against the transferor for payment for the transferee. Nevertheless, if the acceptance of Hiwala was based on the situation that the payer must to be solvent, then the transferee will have a right of recourse if the payer is not solvent. Next, the transferee is entitled to have a right of recourse against the transferor in the situation of death of the payer in bankruptcy, liquidation of an institution which is the payer in the case of bankruptcy before the payment of debt. The payer denies concluding the Hiwala contract and has taken a judicial oath to this effect, and there is no evidence to prove otherwise, and the payer declared bankrupt by a court order. Furthermore, the transferee is entitled to claim the amount of debt assigned to him through Hiwala from the payer. Last but not least, in restricted Hiwala, the transferor is no longer entitled to reclaim from the payer who owed him previously an amount transferred to the payer in respect of the debt to be settled. Next, I will present about the current practices in banking and finance. Al-Hiwala is commonly used as in revolving credit pre and post, trade payable and remittance. For example, a customer who is indebted to a vendor requests a bank to settle his debt. The customer therefore assigns the debt that is evidenced by invoice to the bank. After that, the bank pays the vendor on behalf of the customer. Upon maturity, the customer shall pay the full amount to the bank. The first of current practices in banking and finance is suftaja, which is bills of exchange. Through this practice, it enables the debtor to make payments in another place through his agent or a second person. For example, when a person gives a portion of his property to a merchant to pay to another person in a different person, the standard benefits by insuring himself against the risk of transferring that property to himself. Next is other banking products and facilities. The first of other banking products and facilities is banker's check. A banker's check is a check issued by the bank payable to the order of specific payee for payment within a local area. Any variations of rate will be decided by credit committee on remittance products. It should be accepted as good by the payee as it has been paid for the customer at time of issue. It cannot be returned except for technical reasons such as issuance, cancellation of replacement, reported loss, issuance of MIDF, and cancellation and replacement of MIDF. Second is demand draft. In general, demand draft is a method used by an individual to make a transfer payment from one bank account to another bank account. Demand draft differ from regular normal checks in that they do not require signature to be cashed. For example, if a small business owner purchases product from another company on credit, the small business owner asks his bank to send a demand draft to the company for payment of the products, making him the drawer. The bank issues the draft, making it the drawee. After the draft matures, the owner of the other company brings the demand draft to his banks and collects his payments, making him the payee. Third is the telegraphic transfer. Telegraphic transfer is an electronic method of transferring funds utilized primarily for overseas wire transactions. These transfers are used most commonly in reference to clearinghouse automated payment system transfers in the UK banking system. First is mail transfer. It is an application that receives incoming email from local users and remote senders and forwards outgoing messages for delivery. Last but not least, standing instruction. Standing instructions are a way of making an automatic payment of a fixed amount to a loan, bill, or credit card at the same time every week or month. It can be made from savings or checking account and is most commonly used to make payments to a mortgage, car loan, or to pay bills. There are four conditions for the termination of al-Hawala contract, which are: first, the contracting parties mutually agree to terminate the Hiwala contract. This condition return all of them to the status quo before they enter into the contract. Hence, the transferee is entitled to claim for the debt not from the payer but from the transferor. Second, the settlement of the debt by the payer to the transferee. Third, the death of the payer and the transferee inherits the property. Last but not least, the debt has been written off by the transferee. In conclusion, al-Hiwala is the transfer of debt to another person with the same value as it was. This kind of transfer has many advantages to both parties, which are the transferee and the debtor. As for the debtor, it is good for them as it can minimize and spread his risk because he can remit or pass over his debt to his own debtor, and it could convince the creditor to lend him money since he has somebody to back him up as the transferor of the payment. Apart from that, the creditor could authenticate the loan repayment and ensure that he can retrieve his money back by demanding the payment from the transferor, which is muhal alai. Under normal circumstances or even in case of default payment, it could be retrieved from the transferee.
Thank you for watching.